A lot of South Africans would today, when we say Umkhonto Sizwe, think of something very different. As you know, incidentally, one of the problems with this misunderstanding that you would, in many rooms today, have to clarify which Umkhonto Sizwe are you going to discuss?
We're talking about Umkhonto Sizwe 1. We're talking about the one established by Nelson Mandela in 1961 as a response to the apartheid policy.
Yeah.
And we're going to be speaking about it until its disbandment in December 1993, when it had its final passing out parade. And as a military unit, as an authentic military unit, it's supposed to now be absorbed within the South African National Defence Force. So that's the one I'm hoping we're going to speak about. It's the one I'm prepared for.
When you say one, in English, the option should be two. Except there is no two to that one.
There's the Umkhonto Sizwe Veterans League, which is Kebi Maphatswe. And now there's a party, which is MK3, I would say. So, yeah.
MK. All right. So, what would you sum as the key conditions and the circumstances under which Umkhonto Sizwe is formed in 1961?
Umkhonto Sizwe's formation is a foundation of a dynamic which is related in the creation of South Africa as a political entity. Let me explain what I mean there. If you go to the first president of the ANC, John Dube, in the Pietermaritzburg National Archives, you've got a copy of his acceptance. He was elected in absentia. It's a different world. The world he's speaking about is one which is influenced by African-American thought. Booker T. Washington, he speaks about onwards and upwards, of raising the African majority in South Africa through self-reliance. He also speaks about liberal British imperial ideas, the idea of fair play and justice. But there's a fundamental flaw, which is that the ANC is formed in 1912, and in 1910, the Union of South Africa is established, and that involves passing authority within the British Empire from London to white politicians in South Africa. You can almost see the tension in his acceptance letter, where he's speaking about appealing to British ideals of justice and fair play, but the political center has been moved to South Africa. He can almost feel the tension is going to come in there. The idea originally is that South Africa, the ANC is going to be an organization. It's called the South African Native Nationals Congress in 1912. It's going to be a sort of liaison group which is informing the white politicians in Cape Town and Pretoria about the opinion, the consolidated opinion of the black majority, and will work together in creating opportunities for black social and economic upliftment. It becomes very clear with a barrage of racist legislation that that's not going to be a viable strategy. The most important legislation is the 1913 Natives Land Act. Some people will speak about the ANC being influenced by the Soviet Union and the Bolshevik Revolution to move in a radical direction, but that's not true. If you look even before October, November 1917 and that revolution, you see in newspaper archives and records fragments of ANC evolving discourse. You've got encounters such as rallies which are held between ANC leaders like Saul Msane and members of the International Socialist League. Different discourses, but they're speaking the same language. One of the names of the rallies is called Manufacturing Slave Labor, and the analysis is the same. This South African state is organized around the artificial production of cheap labor to drive mining, capital, and agricultural growth for the white majority. That creates a problem for the ANC, because if that's the strategy of the state, if that's the true nature of the state, then your policy of dialogue, you're going to be in a situation, to borrow a term the ANC started using in the 1940s, of it's a toy telephone. You think there's somebody on the other side of the line, but they're not listening. If that strategy is not going to work, what are you going to do? If you're going to go to London, as the ANC did in 1914 and 1919, and the British say it's not our responsibility, we've passed over authority, you go back to Pretoria, they're not listening, what is your response going to be? You've got to escalate. If you escalate and the state responds with repression, what are you going to do next? That is a fundamental dynamic which is set off by the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910, and its logical conclusion will be a push for a violent solution. That is literally the logic of the liberation struggle in South Africa. That's the dynamic which is unfolding. We can speak about important watersheds, the Defiance Campaign, the Congress of the People Campaign. We can speak about the Anti-Pass Campaign in 1960 launched by the Pan-Africanist Congress. But these are all landmarks which are key points in a coherent dynamic which will lead to the push for a violent solution.
The framework you're setting up is that what becomes the resolution to form Umkhonto Sizwe to resort to violence was actually an inevitability, if I've understood you correctly. And if the answer is yes, which I suspect you will say it is, we know that in other jurisdictions, a mere handing over of power, where the British did the same, the struggle did not go as long as it did here, and it didn't actually also turn violent. Are therefore other conditions which produce the confrontation?
Well, that gets us entangled in all sorts of imperial dynamics. The British decided to fight in certain territories, but the defeat there led them to reappraise imperial strategy. For example, the failure of the Suez invasion led the British to recalibrate their imperial policy. Those sort of things can happen. You know, the French getting bogged down in Algeria will lead them to grant independence to Morocco and Tunisia. You've got those determinants. But what is different in South Africa, and I would say also in Southern Africa generally, we've got to include Rhodesia, for example, here, is the existence of a white settler population and the development, therefore, of settler colonialism, which means that they can't just be a handover of power as part of the logic of imperial retreats. So that's a fundamental and different dynamic.
But why then is, in your reading, the inevitability of violent confrontation in South Africa?
Because the nature of the South African state means that they would not be prepared to make the concessions which would lead to majority rule without a struggle. When Africa is decolonizing north of the Zambezi, the response of white politicians, not just in South Africa, but elsewhere, is we enjoy and we benefit from the status quo and we're prepared to fight it out rather than to hand over power. It's only after long, exhausting, protracted struggle that you get the shift in that dynamic to try and negotiate a different solution.
And of course, this had to be a debate in the ANC, possibly along the same lines. Yeah. But in terms of detail now, as a history professor, if you were to take us to these events and conversations, you know, what I love in the book, which everybody should get, this is an important book. I'm happy Penguin allowed you to write it the way you did. It's a very strange concession you got.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't imagine them allowing anyone else to ever organize a text in the way you did.
I took liberties, yeah.
Yes, it's what you do in most of the cases is to always let us remember at the same time the significant shifts in the regime itself. And often people, I don't think it's a very well-known fact, which you bring up about Verwoerd, that he, at the same time as the conversation since 1955 were going on about turning to arms, there were these attempts on his life. Actually, firstly with an actual gun. And then you say that same day, a conversation of this nature happens elsewhere. But also this group of people accused of treason, when their treason trial concludes, half of them are already speaking about the things they were accused of.
Acquitted of, yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, patiently give us that evolution to the formation of the ANC in December of the 16th of Umkhonto Sizwe, December 16, 1961. and also like these, without forgetting these important meetings and also organizations that allow some people in the ANC to have a voice and an interaction with the regime they wouldn't be able to have within their ANC ranks. Just that activity that leads to 1961. I know it's a long question because I don't want to restrict you in any form.
Well, the first attempt to put ink on paper with regards to the history of Umkhonto Sizwe is a pamphlet, and it's called Action, Reaction and Counteraction. And I think that's a good framing of describing the acceleration from 1948, when the apartheid regime is installed following those elections. And in 1949, the ANC, which has been speaking about moving toward mass action during the 1940s with the establishment of the ANC Youth League, which involves the likes of Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, they engineer the ANC's adoption of a program of action, which is about embarking on mass action to push for majority rule. The initiation of the mass action policies in 1952 with the Defiance Campaign. The government, the state, responds to mass action with mass arrests. By the end of 1952, over 8,000 people are arrested, and that leads members of the ANC, like Nelson Mandela, who was the volunteer-in-chief for the Defiance Campaign, start thinking, in the long run, is there going to be a sustainable path to liberation through non-violent mass action? And they very quickly start thinking no. And it's in 1953 when Walter Sisulu is scheduled to leave South Africa for a youth congress in Bucharest. Just before he goes, Nelson Mandela, who's the president of the ANC in the Transvaal, says, whilst you're out there, why don't you go to China and ask them whether they'll be willing to support us in an armed struggle? Sisulu comes back, and the Chinese, they hear him out and they say, you're not quite fully prepared or serious about armed struggle yet. These are not fully formed ideas. So he comes back empty-handed. But there is an archive of immense importance. People dismiss it because it can be identified as being part of a discredited regime trying to malign its opponents. But I'm speaking about the Treason Trial Archive. One of the responses to the Defiance Campaign is that from about October 1952, the state starts putting policemen in mass meetings of the ANC. They're not hidden, literally white men in there with native translators, and they start taking notes of what people are saying. People speak about the ANC in the 1950s as being non-violent. What is important about that archive is that you've got these people going to these meetings and taking records of what people are talking about. They're talking about Algeria. They're talking about Indochina, Vietnam, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. They're talking about Korea. They're talking about the Egyptian Revolution, and they're talking about Nasser. They're talking about the Chinese Revolution. They're talking about freedom fighters around the world in Asia and Africa who are taking up arms and achieving liberation. Well, that's a bit later in the 1950s.
Okay,
but the ANC is, but the
in the
state
50s, in the Defiance campaigns of 52. Yeah, okay.
And Mau Mau. Oh, Mau Mau is most.
Yes.
And the state feels there's something brewing here. They can't quite tell what it is, but there's a shift here. It's not really a commitment to non-violence. What the treason trial is about is the state basically puts two things together. What these people are saying at these meetings and the Congress of the People, which leads to the Freedom Charter, and what they're literally tried for is that the ANC, according to the state's case, is ANC members are using these meetings to try and incite the masses for a revolution, which is going to unfold in accordance with the Freedom Charter. They say this is a plan for violent revolution. The state can't get a guilty conviction. Why? Because just because people are saying, I support Mau Mau, I back the Kenyan freedom fighters, that's not proof of a conspiracy. But we know now that if the state knew what we knew now of voyages which have been organized to China to see whether you can gain arms, they would have been guilty. They would have been convicted. So the state is not wrong. You can just feel a shift in the zeitgeist that something is changing here. And that's part of the progression that we're on. So the ANC has responded to the mass arrests, which is the state's response to mass protests, by starting to speak about moving to the next stage. that feeling gets accentuated. You've got things like the Congress of the People, you've got the anti-Western areas removals that's associated with Sophia Town. What you start getting during the late 1950s is that the public response to the ANC's calls for non-violent mass protest, people start, the response starts weakening. People start saying, why should we risk getting arrested, criminal records, not being able to obtain employment for these campaigns, which don't seem to advance us any further? What really moves this whole process into a different gear is 18 days between the 21st of March 1960 and 8th of April 1960. What happens there is Sharpeville, the Sharpeville massacre, PAC anti-past protests, and it leads to 69 people being killed in Sharpeville in Langa, as people know.
And we should now no longer say 69 because there's conclusive evidence that there were more than 69 people that were actually killed, because the Sharpeville Foundation, working together with some scientists, historians in the US, actually uncovered that there are lists of individuals, and people in Sharpeville always carried a myth, something that was called a myth. But if you are around Sharpeville's celebrations most of the time, people would always say, because the burials were very strange, the regime, through the police, just said, on the day of the funeral, you come get your coffin and you go straight from police station, which is not far, to the cemetery. Most of these people never actually opened to see inside the coffins. They would say, inside here is Mbuyiseni Ndlozi, and they go bury. But they talk, all of them, about how extra heavy the coffins were. So in some of the police reports and forensic, whatever, autopsy reports, they've now come across an archive which details more names of people who've been missing. People have not known whether these people were killed or what happened to them. The names are coming out. So the official number is standing at 98 or so. This is the historic break from about a year ago. So anyway, just a small but important detail, that Sharpeville is still going on as to how many people. And if you think about it, let's say the state's official line is 69. But let's say they killed, had it been reported that 200 people died, the events you are about to describe gain even a much more powerful weight.
That's very powerful. I mean, but Mignon Breyer, she won the Alan Paton Prize for evidence that I think it's in East London in 1952, there's another incident where exactly the same thing. The number of casualties has been understated. To move back to the crisis of March, April 1960, there's the state of emergency, which is introduced. That's the state's response to the Sharpeville crisis. And then on the 8th of April, they ban both the African National Congress and the PAC. You've got this new situation where the government has responded to mass protest and manifestations of unrest by essentially trying to prohibit and outlaw all opposition. So the ball is now back in the court of the resistance, liberation movements. How are they going to respond? The treason trial is still on. You've got these activists meeting together and they're discussing what should the next phase be. It's from those discussions that two important meetings are held in December 1960. One of them is a meeting of the South African Communist Party, where they decide to form the nucleus of an armed force to prepare for a new stage. That's the wording which they use. The idea is that they're going to make this provisional preparation, and they're also going to foster discussions within the ANC about moving towards that next stage. Two of the people who attend that meeting are Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu. We know them from 1953. They've been convinced from all of that period that an armed struggle is necessary. So they come out of that meeting determined to foster that discussion within the ANC. The other important December meeting is a meeting of African leaders. Many of them are ANC and PAC, but they can't meet as ANC and PAC because the organizations have been banned. And they decide to form a committee, an all-in African committee, to oppose the making of South Africa a republic. Since 1912, South Africa has been part of the British Empire, a dominion of the British Empire. But a referendum in October 1960 approves, a whites-only referendum approves making South Africa a republic, with the 31st of March 1961, 31st of May 1961 being the day at which the republic will come into effect. The All-in African Committee decides to appoint Nelson Mandela as the organizer of the campaign against the republic, and he decides to call a strike from the 29th to the 31st of May 1961. On the first day, he phones the Rand Daily Mail's correspondent Benjamin Pogrund, and he says, "The public response is not what we were hoping for. This closes a chapter on our methods of armed struggle." And on the 31st of May, Mandela makes his first televised appearance. It's an interview with a British journalist, Brian Woodlake. The interview, and
it's online.
Yeah, it's up from it. And he uses very similar wording. He says, based on our experience, the state's response, arresting thousands of people, we need to seriously consider whether our methods that we've pursued so far are still appropriate and applicable.
We cannot continue to be peaceful. That whole statement, I wish I could read it.
I wish I've got it memorized verbatim, but that's
for the. See, I'm too far. For the same reason, for what you're about to say, I think it's important to sort of place it on record. And he gets into a lot of trouble. There are many people who feel that the reaction of the government to our stay at home, ordering a general mobilization, arming the white community, arrest 10,000s of Africans, the show of force through the country, notwithstanding our clear declaration that this campaign is being run on peaceful and non-violent lines, close a chapter as far as our methods of political struggle are concerned. There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people. And I think the time has come for us to consider, in light of our experience in this stay at home, whether the methods which we have applied so far are adequate.
Very similar wording, as I say, to what he'd used 2 days earlier. So he's getting the word out there that policy is being reconsidered. And it's after this that for the first time he raises the possibility of a change of policy within official ANC structures. And the first place he goes to is the ANC National Working Committee. He meets strong opposition from Moses Kotane, who is also the South African Communist Party Secretary General. But after that, Walter Sisulu's mediation enables a situation where Kotane allows Mandela to raise the issue again within the working committee, and the working committee agrees to authorize Mandela to raise it within the National Executive Committee. And that meeting takes place in Natal to accommodate the ANC president, Albert Luthuli, who's banned and restricted to the Natal area. And the ANC meeting decides to approve Nelson Mandela's call for the creation of an armed force to supplement and move away from strictly non-violent strategy. But then there's a meeting held the following day in Stanger of the executives of the Congress Alliance, because the ANC is a member of an alliance structure alongside other Congress organizations, the Congress of Democrats, which is whites, the South African Colored People's Congress, the South African Indian Congress, and we can go on. It's a means of mobilizing different communities under a common banner. And to Mandela's dismay, Luthuli opens the meeting by saying, let's consider the matter of violence afresh, as if the ANC has not made this decision. Because of the dynamics of the Congress Alliance, with the ANC being by far the most strongest constituents, if the ANC had come in there saying, we've taken this policy, it would have set the Congress Alliance in that particular direction. But Luthuli has basically authorized them to start again the whole discussion from scratch. The discussion is long, it's protracted. Mandela, for a long period, feels as though he's losing because the leaders of the South African Communist Party, Kotane, the ANC, Albert Luthuli, and the South African Indian Congress, Monty Naika, they're all speaking out against nonviolence. So he feels that it's going the wrong way. What eventually breaks is Moses Kotane, who basically says, let's have a compromise. Let Mandela go forward and form this military structure with those who are willing to work with him. We continue as the ANC with our policy of nonviolence, and the only way that that can be changed is by a national conference. So an anorak fact is that the Umkhonto Sizwe is not the military wing of the ANC, properly speaking, until October 1962, when a national conference decides to embrace the policy of armed struggle. That's the Labatsi conference, which is held in Bechuanaland.
Yes.
But under that agreement, which is reached at Stanger, Nelson Mandela is authorized to go ahead and build this military force. He will not be disciplined by the ANC, but he has to report back. ANC policy, official policy, is nonviolent until a national conference decides otherwise. That gives Mandela the leeway to join with Joe Slovo, because under the terms of the South African Communist Party's December 1960 resolution, where they decide to form the nucleus of an armed force, the ANC has decided, the South African Communist Party has decided to build that nucleus. For example, by the time Mandela gets this authorization, you've got ANC leaders, including Raymond Mhlaba, Wilton Mkwai. They're in China. They're meeting Chairman Mao towards the end of December 1961. They're outside the country. They're going to be receiving military training. 4 of them will be receiving military training in Nanking. Slovo and Mandela, they bring their forces together, and the name that they decide to give this force is Umkhonto Sizwe, Spear of the Nation. And by the end of 1961, MK, the abbreviation of Umkhonto Sizwe, will be officially operating. It's got regional command structures in Port Elizabeth, in Johannesburg, and in Durban. They were supposed to launch on the 16th of December, but something got lost in communication, and Durban understood the message to mean that conduct your operations so that when South Africa is celebrating the Day of the Vow, the headlines will be the launch of this new armed force. So it's actually on the 15th of December that MK units in Durban decide to target Bantu, Coloured, and Indian Affairs buildings. The 2 which target the Indian and Coloured Affairs buildings fail, but there's one in Ordnance Road in Durban where it's not a devastating explosion, but it is a explosion. Subia Mudli, Ronnie Casriels, Bruno Mtola, that's the unit of 3, and that is actually the official launch. So officially, it's the 16th of December. Actually, it's the 15th of December when Umkhonto Sizwe is launched. 16th of December, Port Elizabeth and Johannesburg units go into action. Before the operation starts, there are handbills which are distributed and posted up in those 2 cities containing the Umkhonto Sizwe manifesto, outlining the principles behind their rebellion.
Another character that is not in the country when these discussions you're speaking about are unfolding, in which Kotane, Luthuli are reluctant that we have not exhausted peaceful means. But Oliver Tambo is already out of the country. Just take us through that and the reunion, as it were, of himself and Madiba in exile, because then they start this journey of setting up the ANC in exile on the one hand, but they start having to look for support.
It's a tough story. Look, it's during the Sharpeville crisis, it's in March 1960 that Tambo leaves the country to establish the external mission. So this is before Umkhonto Sizwe is formed. There's actually an incident before he meets Mandela. He meets this group containing Raymond Mhlaba and Wilton Mqwayi. These are ANC members. They're returning from China. When Tambo meets them, he's actually upset because he's supposed to be the leader of the ANC in exile. He's supposed to know everything that's going on. There are these ANC members who are outside the country. He doesn't know what they're doing outside the country. They start briefing him about how they've been receiving military training. And he's like, Mandela will be arrested, as people will know, in August 1962. And after that, Mhlaba becomes the commander of Umkhonto Sizwe. But after MK launches in December 1961, Mandela, who's still the commander-in-chief at that time, he goes abroad for his tour of Africa. He leaves South Africa in January 1962 for a conference in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. And he's there to meet with leaders of independent Africa about securing agreements for military cooperation to enable Umkhonto Sizwe to escalate its armed struggle. Just to explain, if we go back to the MK Manifesto, which is distributed on the 16th of December 1961, there's source. My interest in forming Umkhonto Sizwe was based on a sort of paradox in that founding manifesto where they speak about we've always tried to avoid bloodshed and civil clash, and we do so still. I'm paraphrasing what they're saying there. Very interesting concept about going to war to avoid war. They want the first acts to be warning shots. And that informs their decision, which they will follow for at least the first year of Umkhonto Sizwe operations, that their military operations are going to be sabotage. The aim is to make them bloodless operations. Why? Because they want to alert South Africans of the need to avoid civil clash and hopefully lead to a negotiated settlement which will avoid civil war. At the same time, they're making provisions for escalation, and that's why Nelson Mandela is out of the country in January, February 1962. What he's doing is he wants to form these links with independent African countries, which will provide MK with the training to enable them to escalate if needs be. So Mandela and Tambo, they meet in Ethiopia. Mandela reads the ANC's address. If you read Fatima Mia's Higher Than Hope, it's about how he announces the formation of Umkhonto Sizwe, and there's a Ugandan diplomat who says he's exultant, the idea that South Africa's moving towards fighting back against white minority rule. Mandela's first military training of any sort is when he is in Morocco in March, where he and Robbie Resha, who's also a member of the ANC, they have firearms playing in Kesha. He goes to, there's photographs of him in London, Mandela, where he meets British politicians.
He's in Morocco, but he's being trained not by the Moroccans.
By the Algerian freedom fighters.
Yes.
Who are just about to achieve their independence. The Evian Accords.
I mean, this is important because these terms and these names today are very important. Mandela is not getting a military training by the Moroccans. It's important because Morocco likes to have that claim. Of course, they had allowed the operations of the, and it's called what? NFL. But it's those chaps. The Algerians.
The Algerian freedom fighters.
That are training Madiba.
Yeah.
Yes.
When he's in Algeria, it's just days after the Algerians and the French, though, have signed the so-called Evian Accords, which will provide for the referendum, which will provide for Algerian independence. It's sort of, he's there in March, and it's about June, July that Algeria achieves independence. So they're just really on the eve of Algerian emancipation. After he comes back from having gone to Europe, he goes to West Africa. I'm speaking about Mandela now. And he receives formal military training in a suburb of Addis Ababa from the Ethiopians. But he's recalled whilst he's there to come back because it's a message from South Africa that he needs to be closer to home because recruitment is being upscaled and he needs to be at home coordinating and commanding. And actually, as he comes home, his path takes him to Tanganyika, Tanzania. And in Dar es Salaam, he meets ANC recruits who have been sent out to the country, the first group. And he says, I've received training in Ethiopia. You're going to be trained in Ethiopia. I'm on my way home. And he meets them for the first time. It's the first time he's saluted by MK cadres. He returns to South Africa. He's by now known as the Black Pimpernel or the Scarlet Pimpernel of Africa. But as we know, well, as I mentioned, the Stanger resolution is you've got to report back. He comes back. He goes to Lilisley Farm, which is an underground headquarters, which is purchased in Rivonia. He briefs the other members of the ANC Revolutionary Underground about his trip abroad, the money he's received, the promises of training. He's got to go to Natal. He briefs Albert Luthuli about the same. He also meets the ANC's Durban Command, led by Colonel Ndlovu, but also other members are Ronnie Castrals, who we've met previously. And it's in Howick, as I'm sure everybody knows, that he's arrested on the 5th of August, 1962. He's going to be tried for leaving the country illegally and inciting a demonstration because the state doesn't quite have enough information yet to implicate him for being the leader of Umkhonto Sizwe. The immediate commander after Sisulu's arrest is, the immediate commander after Mandela's arrest is actually Walter Sisulu on an interim basis.
Yes.
But then the permanent one is going to be Raymond Mhlaba, because he's got the most military training, being part of that group which had gone to, yeah, that's right. But Sisulu, Mhlaba, Dennis Goldberg, Andrew Mlangeni, who's also one of the China group, they are all arrested at the Lilisley Farm underground headquarters in Rivonia in the 11th of July, 1963. And as part of that arrest, the state obtains documents which give them enough information to also
include
Mandela, yeah, as accused number one.
There are interesting things in this short history that I want to get into. Very funny, in fact. There's the rival organization, obviously, the Pan-Africanist Congress. It is also embarking on a similar path. In conversations with myself, I think that's what the book is called, Mandela extends some of the observations he makes in Long Walk to Freedom about the difficulty in these meetings with leaders of the continent, where they say, yeah, ANC, you chaps though, why don't you wait for Sobukwe? And then you can talk about this thing when Sobukwe is back from prison, because they're thinking he's just serving a 5-year sentence or so. Madiba and them begin to realize the PAC is not only big in the continent, it has made a huge impression, but seemingly the story is that the ANC is actually a front of white communists. And the Africanists in the continent are uncomfortable. And they keep raising this challenge. So part of the perception they have to fight in the continent is that, and Mandela talks about it very openly, that in some meeting, it was so put on the table in strong terms that when they left, he's like, we've got to start having organizational programs that are distinctly ANC.
To make clear that the ANC
to make
is
clear
the
that the ANC is an organization of its own.
But that dogs them for many years. Listen, for a longest time, people like Joe Slovo, who's the co-founder of Mandela's the commander-in-chief, but Slovo's the co-founder. He's not able to operate in Africa because there is such a stigma over this idea that the ANC is dominated by white and Indian communists that people like Yusuf Dadu and Joe Slovo, they're not able to operate in Zambia and Tanzania. They've got to go to London to form a command group there. Only after 1969, when they're integrated into the Revolutionary Council, don't want to get ahead of ourselves, that they're able to really be integrated into ANC work.
The second thing is of importance, I think, in these few years that you've just traversed. The activities in the regime now. And I want you to, as you put them in the book, who is the president? And there is escalation over the ANC. SACP is long banned with the Anti-Communist Act, but who's the president of South Africa or the head of state at the time? What is happening to them?
After South Africa becomes a republic, South Africa's first state president is somebody by the name of C.R. Swart, but the real man in charge, the hard man of the cabinet who's involved in the day-to-day running of governance is H.F. Verwoerd. He's the prime minister. Until the 1980s, the prime minister is actually the person who's in charge of the operations of the government. So the ANC basically sets Umkhonto we-Sizwe sets the challenge to the government. Let's try, will you respond to our initiative and avoid civil war by engaging in negotiations? The response of the government is, well, it is that they introduce what is known as the Sabotage Act, which basically introduces punishments up to the death penalty for being involved in sabotage. So they're not going to compromise. So one of the things that Mandela reports back on when he comes back from Africa is money which has been received, the idea for the ANC to develop a more independent image, as you've been saying, not to be seen to be dominated by white and Indian communists. But then the other one is that we've got to make preparations for guerrilla warfare. And that's the origins of what will be known as Operation Maibuya. Because when the Rivonia raid takes place in July 1973, one of the documents which they find is a document called Operation Maibuya, which is drafted by a member of the South African Communist Party by the name of Arthur Goldreich, in whose name Lillisley Farm was rented out. And it's a plan for guerrilla warfare. So, yeah.
1963.
1963,
Yes.
Sorry if I made a mistake there. July 1963 is the Rivonia raid.
Okay, so the chaps are arrested, and this is the famous treason trial. No, Rivonia trial.
That's right.
Yes. I guess it's time to focus now on Umkhonto we-Sizwe now being taken over by Mhlaba.
Yeah.
But what is O.R. Tambo at the moment? I mean, he's the deputy president of the ANC, to Luthuli as the president. Luthuli, you will tell us. Take us through 63 to 69.
Okay, 63 to 69. Let's start with October 1962, when the conference officially adopts armed struggle as a policy, and therefore it becomes officially the ANC's military wing. Umkhonto we-Sizwe becomes the ANC's military wing. We've spoken about the path towards the Rivonia raid, where Mhlaba is arrested. Wilton Mqwayi, who's one of the members who went to the group in China, he comes back to Lillisley Farm on the evening of the 11th of July, 1963. He sees big police dogs on the farm. He realizes something is wrong, and he retreats to Soweto. And by October, November 1963, he is going to establish the second high command of Umkhonto we-Sizwe alongside Lionel Gay is one of the people who's with him, and John Matthews is another. But they're operating under severely constrained conditions. Training continues in places like China. There's a group which comes to South Africa in 1964, and Mqwayi tells them to organize, to train recruits as best as they can. But by then, Lionel Gay and John Matthews have already been arrested as part of a sweep in sort of June, July 1964. Mqwayi will continue operating until September, October 1964. He meets somebody by the name of Bartholomew Hlapane. But then the day after the meeting, Hlapane gets arrested. And then a month later, he's going to join the police in the police raid, which will see Wilton Mqwayi arrested. And you've got a slow, gradual process by which the command of Umkhonto we-Sizwe will shift. Yeah, the underground structures will be eradicated, and there's a slow transition to command and control being exercised outside the country. Somebody by the name of Ambrose Makiwane becomes the commander of Umkhonto we-Sizwe. That lasts until November 1965, when the leadership will pass to Joe Modise, and he's going to be the commander of Umkhonto we-Sizwe until it's basically disbanded in 93. Joe Medice's plan is he organizes MK recruits in exile. rough estimates, and not very precise numbers, is that there are about 1,000 recruits of MK who managed to leave the country and receive training in places like China, the Soviet Union from 1964. It's in April 1964 that Oliver Tambo goes to Moscow and he signs an official cooperation agreement. By the end of 1964, you've got like 400 recruits who are in the Soviet Union. From about December, they start receiving training at a military camp in Odessa, present-day Ukraine, where the Soviets have this facility for training freedom fighters from all over the world. But others get trained in places like Algeria, places like Egypt. By process of elimination, the Soviet Union gets established as being the default place where MK members will be trained. Training in places like Egypt is inappropriate because, amongst other things, the people coming back saying, we got trained in fatigue marches. It's not really appropriate for guerrilla warfare, so Egypt won't work. And Egypt is the African country with the most advanced military establishment. China, there's the Sino-Soviet split, and eventually, Moscow and Beijing tell people, you got to choose. It's either them or us. And the ANC, for various reasons, says we're going with Moscow under those circumstances. The Soviets are able to provide much better holistic training. Joe Medisa's plan from 1965 is we're going to send small units to different parts of South Africa to seed armed struggle.
And what happens now, because maybe you are about to say that, because the strategy up to the elimination or the destruction of the command structures, the structures inside the country before high command moves outside, but also the massive arrests of the sort of first generation. We are targeting what they call symbolic places, symbolic areas, and in a general sabotage. When does that change? And under what circumstances? Is there a debate? Is there a meeting where they say, enough with sabotage?
The first indication is in the second manifesto of Umkhonto Sizwe, which is distributed on its first anniversary. That is going to be 16th December 1962. And there's a statement there where the High Command says, we don't believe that sabotage actions by and themselves are going to eliminate this government. We're going to have to escalate the struggle. I've spoken about how when Mandela came back from South Africa is in Africa, of course, but you know what I mean. From his tour of the rest of the continent, he said that we need to start, the government has shown that they're not going to compromise. We need to start talking about guerrilla warfare. So those discussions are basically there. The seeds of the discussion are there. Operation Maibuya is Arthur Goldreich being commissioned by the High Command to actually start developing these plans. But the plan is not implemented by July 1963 because literally the plan is out there on the table and they're going to discuss it because some people are saying this is far too ambitious. You're speaking about landing people on the coastline of South Africa, but we're having increasing trouble operating and moving throughout Africa because by then what is known as the Central African Federation, which involves Southern Rhodesia's white minority government, is dominated by them. They start beginning to arrest ANC members as they're traveling.
As they try to come back.
Yeah. So what we get in the archive are fragments. If you can piece them together, if you've got comprehensive enough discussion where you see the evolution in the ANC's thinking is towards the second half of 1962 that they're starting talking about the need to move towards guerrilla warfare. The Wilton Mqwai Command is not able to do it because literally after the Rivonia raid, the underground is on the back foot. They can't be planning guerrilla warfare. They're just trying to survive. And eventually the underground is eradicated. But the plans for guerrilla warfare are resumed by Joe Medisa. His plan is let's send small groups to different parts of South Africa where they will start mobilizing the masses, forming guerrilla bases, and then we can start developing armed struggle. The problem is how are you going to get from Tanzania to South Africa? Because what South Africa benefits from is a corridor of buffer states which are ruled by white minority governments. That includes Rhodesia, but it also includes Portuguese-controlled Mozambique and Angola, which shields South African-controlled Namibia. So it's, how are you going to get there? And for a lot
something happens in Botswana?
Well, just before Botswana becomes independent in 1966, there's a group of 7 ANC members who are trying to reconnoiter an infiltration route. They get arrested. It's on the 26th of September 1966. Botswana is independent 4 days later. Seretse Khama's incoming government decide after having threatened to deport them to South Africa.
Yes, to face the full might of the law.
He says, we're going to actually send them back to Zambia, but if this happens again, there's going to be tough action, and that's obviously indicates or threatening.
Prof, you're jumping, and I keep thinking you might do that. The setup, something has to happen for Lusaka to be set up. And we know for a couple of few years, the Zambians are not comfortable with liberation forces that are not from immediate countries. And so ANC or South Africans have problems in Zambia. It's covered in here. Until Kenneth Kaunda opens a conversation with Mobutu Seseko on the one hand to say, Chief, Zambia can't handle everybody alone.
Yeah.
Tanzania must be responsible for Mozambique. The DRC must be responsible for Angola.
Yeah.
Because Malawi is not coming to the party. And then Zambia will be responsible for Southern Africa, but with the help of Tanzania.
Yeah.
But already there is a setup in Tanzania, in Lusaka, that Nyerere has indulged. Just that important history, because it's going to be immediately critical to the missions that Joe Modise is about to design. Because they include joint operations with other liberation forces. That the actual thinking of these people is precisely along the lines that you are drafting. We're confronted with a wide controlled area, but this control is across countries.
Yeah.
And the whites cooperate, intelligence, they themselves have joint military operations against liberation forces. I just want the initial point about the setup in Lusaka.
To get to Lusaka, you need to have the opportunity to proceed from Tanzania. After the recruits in the Soviet Union start coming back to Tanzania, they start forming an ANC military base at a place called Kongwa. And at that Kongwa camp, the ANC shares it with freedom fighters from other countries, including the MPLA, Angola, SWAPO, Namibia, Frelimo, Mozambique. From Tanzania, you can cross the Ruvuma and start an armed struggle, as Frelimo does. I think it's in August 1964. SWAPO, after Zambia achieves its independence in 1964, that enables SWAPO to get to Namibia via Zambia. The problem is that, number one, there's just a practical thing. We spoke about Botswana's independence. Botswana doesn't have an armed force until the 1970s. Zambia doesn't necessarily have an armed force. The force, it had been part of the Central African Federation, which is dominated by Southern Rhodesia's whites. After Southern Rhodesia becomes independent, November 1965, unilateral declaration of independence. If you go to the newspaper reports, that evening, there is a standoff across the Zambezi where Ian Smith moves Rhodesian armed forces there. Against them, there's a sort of token Northern Rhodesian force, but who is commanding this independent African force? It's basically Southern Rhodesian whites. That's the military capacity. Basically, Zambia has no military capacity. And what Kenneth Kaunda is terrified by is Zambia becoming a crossroads of all of these conflicts, and the country literally implodes as a result of Portuguese incursions, South African incursions. If it becomes a sort of central highway for all of these conflicts. So he starts speaking about he develops this philosophy. Well, he has this philosophy of humanism, and it's a non-violent philosophy. And for the first couple of years, he starts speaking about how I'm going to use a non-violent path of dialogue with these white governments. It takes a couple of years, but it also costs the ANC a couple of years where it's not really able to operate through Zambia. It's when Zambia becomes a target anyway, when you've got the Portuguese government launching incursions into the country, where Kenneth Kaunda, the letter that to Mobutu that you spoke about, is basically saying, whilst we've tried to stay out of this, we have to realize that we're in it, and what we need is a division of labor where we cooperate in terms of the cooperation that we offer, and that's the deal which he offers, the one that you've outlined.
But also there is a committee within the African Union which is committed to assisting liberation movements.
The Liberation Committee, yes.
The Liberation Committee. What is the interaction of that Liberation Committee with South Africa's efforts, and maybe the role of South Africa's efforts to set up camp, to set up campaigns for liberation?
Well, the premise of the Liberation Committee is that we're going to support fighting units. That's the only language that makes sense, because the white minority governments have refused all approaches to negotiate a settlement. And what you literally have is, if you're not engaged in an armed struggle, you're not going to be recognized by Africa. There's a very interesting analogous case. And what I mean by this is that in Namibia, the ANC of Southwest Africa, Namibia, is not SWAPO. In 1960, 1961, it's SWANU, the Southwest African National Union.
Yes.
But SWANU is never able to coordinate an armed struggle, and so it doesn't get official recognition. And how this works in the diplomacy of this is that if you're not fighting, you've just got diplomats in exile who are empty mouths, who are demanding subsidies from the Organization of African Unity. And the OAU's basically said, we're not going to support you unless you can show that you're fighting. And it's that dynamic which leads to SWANU being superseded by SWAPO. What I'm saying is that some people will look at the armed struggle during the 1960s, and they will say that because South Africa is not, because the ANC is not establishing guerrilla zones in South Africa, therefore that the armed struggle is not being effective. But there are many uses. It's politics by other means, as Clausewitz says. And one of the politics is basically remaining viable as an organization. And I would submit to people that if the ANC took the advice which some people are recommending after they've been repressed within South Africa, forced to go in exile, if they'd gone to Tanzania and said, we're not going to fight, but we want independent Africa to subsidize us, they wouldn't have got recognized. That would have created an opening. We've spoken about these narratives of the PAC. That support which went to the ANC would have gone to the PAC. And diplomacy is a hard business. And what I mean by that is the Soviets, this is real politique on their side. They're not going to jeopardize their relations with independent Africa to support rebel and pariah organizations. Sometimes in a military unit, you have got to undertake what would amount to basically being suicide operations. If I may take an analogy, if we go back to the Second World War, I was speaking within the realm of white South Africans. South African Air Force was compelled to take missions into Poland during the Second World War, where there was basically no chance of success. And one of the interesting interviews with one of the South African commanders, he goes to Italy to protest about these suicide missions. And one of the people he meets is Winston Churchill, and he speaks him out and he says, and after he's made his case, Winston Churchill turns to him and says, you're right. This isn't a military operation. This is a political operation, and you're going to have to go and perform it. Now, military experts will say, there was no chance with these operations into Rhodesia in 1967 of ever reaching South Africa, and there's a very good chance that they were right. But there's also a very good chance that if ANC didn't undertake this, because African governments are already saying, we're subsidizing these guys in this camp in Congo. They keep talking about armed struggle and producing pamphlets.
But they haven't done anything.
Absolutely nothing. They had to do it.
Let's go into Modise. I will return to this maybe at a later stage. I think we're still building momentum. There is a worry in the debate, both in the private and in the meetings, that Kotani keeps saying to Madiba about the organizational capacity for an armed confrontation. That why do you insist on this? You will just be subjecting our people into massacres. And I wonder, despite the fact that the conditions were, completely against peaceful demonstration, pickets, and all of that, I wonder if we'll return to the nonetheless important strategic question in Kotani. The military organization is different to mobilization. Military organization is something fundamentally different. If there was immature, half-baked attempts that did not fully appreciate the last time Africans had engaged in a military confrontation, they were not even fighting with guns.
Yeah.
We could say in the war, they participated without being given guns. They were not allowed to carry guns, even in the World War. So in the Anglo-Boer War, some maybe did, but to a large extent, they were not allowed. And then in the World War, so in many ways, this was a very demilitarized community.
Yeah.
A community without any training. I mean, even the police, the African police, were not heavily trained in a sophisticated. So there is an argument to be made for this was a leap.
That is the dominant argument. But if I were to go back in time and I were an advisor to the ANC leadership, I would speak against that dominant argument. And when I speak about the dominant argument, if you go to the literature, this is people will say it was premature. If you look at the 30 years of armed struggle, that there were limits to the effectiveness. But if I were to go back in time and I were to be an advisor, I would say an assumption behind that critique is that there's some sort of inevitability and predestination. The ANC is somehow automatically, inevitably, and eternally the leader of the Black African population, and that there's nothing that will ever lead to a rival emerging. The argument presumes that there weren't people inside South Africa who tried to resist the government non-violently, that we don't know what happened or what would happen in those cases, that there's some sort of suspense about whether they would have been able to operate and resist the government, or whether they would have been arrested, they would have been tortured, and many people...
I'm not interested in the not making of the decision. I think the decision is a correct decision. I'm asking for a different assessment. Once you take that path, you ought to deal with the Kotani Wuni military organization. Military organization, from the point of view of the circumstances I'm describing, Mandela, these are not soldiers. They're in their 40s already. Lutuli, Mhlaba, these are lawyers and peasants and industrial workers who, in military terms, you gotta be conscripted at 16, sometimes 18. And by the time you are 40, you have understood physically and mentally and, war, particularly guerrilla. It's the most complicated of the wars that, one can embark on. I'm just saying the Boers had just been defeated and they had much more military. They had lived their entire lives as a military community.
Yeah.
And they met their embarrassing defeats at the hands of the British. And the British cut them a deal of the unification of the white community.
Yeah.
But they fought bravely, obviously, blah, blah, blah. But you have that example. You know, this is not your community. So Kotani's warning is what you are talking about, Madiba, is not just arming people. It has to have a serious level of organization. And I wonder, from 61, when Mudisa takes, so of course you're fighting symbols you are trained so that then you have to fight your way, you must fight your way to, they say, you must fight your way to the last man. They put it like that. But nonetheless, this is a very, very underprepared, underexperienced, and under-equipped force. So let's go to Maibuye, and when now they do what you call, I think they call it that too, the missions that are trying to come into the country under guerrilla warfare. When they try now to work into, and we'll return to this critique about what does preparation, what does transformation into a military organization really look like? And does the ANC at any stage ever achieve this? So let's go to Mudisa, and then maybe after Swanky and Sipolilo and Morogoro, we can return to the same question.
Yeah, after the failure of the infiltration that we discussed into Botswana, the ANC adopts a strategy of fighting alongside other liberation movements. So you're not operating through Black African countries which don't want ANC members there, that you're operating alongside fellow liberation movements. And so that leads to two operations. One is more a reconnaissance than an operation, where ANC members, a group of 7, go alongside Frelimo in June 1967 to try and see whether there's a route to what is basically the Kruger National Park. They go into the Nyasa and Cabo Delgado provinces, but neither of them finds a route through. One of them gets ambushed, but that doesn't succeed. The other much more famous and well-known operation is it becomes known as the Wankie Campaign, where a group of 81 ANC ZAPU members, so it's a mixed group.
What is ZAPU?
ZAPU is the Zimbabwe African People's Union, which is the Zimbabwean Liberation Organization fighting to overthrow Rhodesian UDI. And so the ZAPU contingent is known as the Lobengula Detachment, and the idea is that they will infiltrate alongside ANC members. A group of 20 ANC members are going to stay alongside ZAPU in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, and they're going to fight in Lupane and Cholocho, whilst another group of ANC members, a group of 30 ANC members, are going to go to South Africa. And that group of 30, which is scheduled to go to South Africa, is known as the Luthuli Detachment, after Chief Albert Luthuli, who is killed just before the infiltration begins. I can't remember the exact dates of his death, but it's just as they're preparing, they receive news that Luthuli has been hit by a train. And so it becomes known as the Luthuli Detachment. But that's the idea. 2 guerrilla zones in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, and then another group of 30, an ANC platoon, is going to go to South Africa. And once the Luthuli Detachment gets into South Africa, it's going to separate into small groups, which is going to start armed struggle in about 7 areas of the country.
It is at this stage that I think you must define conceptually for us, what is a guerrilla warfare? Because of the units, the sheer numbers you're speaking about. The total is 81, 30 of which end up with a mission to somehow they hope to arrive in South Africa. But maybe what is a guerrilla warfare, so that we understand what are these people, what are they in a mission to go and achieve?
Yeah, so the idea that a group of 30 is going to be able to defeat the South African Defence Force, which can mobilize hundreds of thousands of men, literally, That's not going to work. But what might work, and this is the ANC's plan, is that you can mobilize the masses because South Africa is a majority black country. So you've got these people with military training. They're going to go into communities. They're going to start recruiting local communities. They're going to start giving them military training. And once that happens, the ANC is going to be able to use what it calls this Ho Chi Minh Trail after the Zimbabwean example. You build a Ho Chi Minh Trail through Zimbabwe, which leads to South Africa. And once that trail has been established, you can bring supplies of military weaponry and also the rest of the ANC's 1,000-odd members who are in exile to come and reinforce those groups once they've laid the groundwork. And once you've got those guerrilla zones, but the crucial decisive impact is being able to bring in local communities because South Africa is an overwhelmingly black country, and that is how you redress the asymmetry. So it's a very long road. Even if the Ho Chi Minh Trail had been completed, there's a very long road from there to actually starting guerrilla warfare.
So let's map it for everybody. We'll try to have the images. What is the point of departure? Okay, firstly, where is the unit based when this mission is conceived, agreed upon, the unit is constituted? Where are they?
Well, they are in Zambia because Kaunda, who up until that point had a policy of no groups larger than 6 will be allowed into the country and no extra groups will be allowed in until that group has gone. The OAU puts pressure on him and he eventually says he reaches a point early in 1967 where he will allow larger groups to go. So they come from Tanzania into Zambia. They're at various...
So the plan is conceived in Tanzania.
Yes.
And then they go to Zambia.
Yes.
And where is the drop-off where they finally now are addressed for the last time by Mbuyiseni, Tambo, and...
It's close to Victoria Falls. It's on the actual infiltration is on the 2nd of August, 1967. And it's, Tambo, Modise, and Thomas Nkobe, who's the treasurer of the ANC. They go there, they give them the final briefing before they infiltrate. And the infiltration is on the 2nd of August, 1967.
And it's interesting because the names, I think we must read them to the record. The leader of Lutuli unit, the Lutuli detachment, is a chap by the name of, I want to read because I've got it somewhere, Mongameli Charlie, but TSHALI, it's Charlie. Yeah? It's Charlie. Is that closer? Mongameli Charlie. Charlie or Charlie? Charlie. This is the chap. His name is not that known, And a chap called John Dube. He's not the John Dube of the...
Not the founder.
The founder, yes. And Chris is a political commissar.
Hani, yes.
Yeah, Chris Hani, yes. But the two main commanders of, as you put it, as I understand, of this unit, maybe if I think I find this interesting.
So Dube is the overall commander because as they're going to be operating in Zimbabwe, they want a Zimbabwean commando. But Charlie is the leader of the
Lutuli detachment,
which is going to South Africa.
There you go. But there are all other names, and if I keep paging until I find them, please proceed. The members of the reconnaissance team: Zolile Ngose, Rachidi Kawawa, Eric Nduna, Joseph Nduli, Piri Malama, who are still in the company of Mzala, Don Masego, Amos Ndlovu. These are the names.
But the problem which is being explained there is that it's very difficult to operate because they go into thick bush. So it's very good with regards to concealment, but actually navigating is very difficult. Another difficulty which they face is that the escarpment up there is very dry and it's very difficult to get water, and it creates a problem once you're detected. You become predictable because you need water to survive, and therefore ambush positions can be set at watering holes, and that becomes a very big difficulty for them once they're detected. So they have all sorts of problems with regards to reconnoitering the way forward. Members of the unit get lost. About 6 or 7 days after the crossing, a member of the unit gets discovered by the Rhodesians, who thereafter decide to establish a joint operations center, and the hunt is then on. The first battle is the Battle of Nyature, which is on the 13th of August. So it's just 11 days after they're infiltrated. And this involves the Lupane group who've branched off already. And that battle ends up in a draw. But this is the problem, which is that the Rhodesians are able to bring in reinforcements. And these groups which become isolated, the ANC ZAPU groups, are not able to.
So they're not able to reinforce.
They're not able to reinforce. So the odds become increasingly unfavorable as time goes on. And then there's another battle on the 18th where that Lupane group is basically destroyed, where John Dube is the only person who manages to get away without being killed or captured. Then the hunt is on for the Cholocho group, which is the other group which is going to be operating in the southern part of Zimbabwe, and the Lutuli detachment, so they're still together. And just south of the Hwange game park, Wankie campaign, that's where it gets its name from. They get detected from the Rhodesians. The South African ZAPU unit wins consecutive battles on the 22nd and the 23rd of August, but the problem of reinforcements mean that even though that they're forced to flee, the Rhodesians are able to fly in reinforcements, and it becomes increasingly unfavorable. And eventually, 2 or 3 days after their second victory, Charlie and the commanders, they hold a meeting and they say, we're not going to be able to make it through to South Africa. We've got to retreat to Botswana, and that's what they do. So that's decision, which leads to the Wankie campaign failing without having achieved its objective. The Sipolilo campaign starts in December. The differences from the
Before we go to Sipolilo, how many losses did they suffer from 81 in?
The exact figures I don't recall, but they're in the book. Basically, about 40 of them managed to get to Botswana.
So half of them.
Yeah.
Almost.
And the remainder are killed or captured. A couple managed to infiltrate South Africa, but they get arrested quite soon afterwards. So the ANC and the ZAPU, they try again.
Sipolilo now.
That's right. About 119 members are going to be involved. The differences from the Wankie campaign are the following. Rather than one infiltration, there's going to be echelons. So the infiltration is from December until February, where they infiltrate in small groups. That's one difference. Another difference is that whereas the Wankie group, they were mobile and they got isolated and they were cut off from reinforcements, the difference in the Sipolilo campaign is that they're going to build a network of base camps which can reinforce and supply each other. A continuous pipeline. Problems which they face inter alia are food. That leads to you exposing yourself. I mean, amongst other things that they do is they start hunting big game, but that causes patterns in big game migration where people see that there's distress amongst animals, so there's a sign that something is wrong there. Another group they try and source food from a local farm. People see that these people are outsiders. It leads to the Rhodesians being tipped off. There are all sorts of problems. Another is that even though they're trying to operate without being detected, there's another incident where a Rhodesian parks and wildlife official, he notices footprint of a large group of people leading to a mountain. All of these signs lead to the Rhodesians establishing a joint operations center. And when aerial reconnaissance starts being stepped up, Moffat Hadebe, who is the commander of this detachment, this infiltration it's known as the Pyramid Detachment.
Yes.
And after this reconnaissance starts stepping up, Moffat Hadebe, who is ZAPU, he calls on the guerrillas to assemble in one of the camps, which is Base 5. By then, they'll have established 6 camps. But then he calls on them to establish Base 5 because if they're too separated, they won't be able to resist the Rhodesians if they're attacked. What happens is that on the 18th of March, 1968, the Rhodesians bomb Base 5. The problem there is that it causes them to disperse, and they are dispersed in such small groups that they're not able to put up effective resistance, and it becomes a mopping up operation as far as the Rhodesians are concerned. That leads to the failure of the second of the 3 infiltrations. There is a third infiltration, which has not received a name, but this is what causes a crisis within the ANC, because even before that, members of the ANC and ZAPU who are in their camps, the news gets back of the failure of these 2 infiltrations. And when there is news that there's going to be a third infiltration, there is dissent within the military camps. You start having a problem of desertion, of people fleeing ANC camps to go to Kenya, where many of them appear. They don't want this third infiltration. But the third infiltration happens nonetheless, and that one gets quickly detected and eliminated by the Rhodesians, upon which the crisis mutates in the following sense, which is that members of the Wankie campaign, they start getting released by the Botswana government in 1968, and they start returning to
the camps.
Yeah. And people like Chris Hani start saying, where's the armed struggle? It looks like we've given up. They haven't given up. It's that a lot of the military capacity has been destroyed that the ANC had. There's huge dissent within the camps with people who don't want to go on these missions because they feel as though now that these are suicide missions. So if you've got to look at it from Joe Medisa's perspective, on the one hand, he's being pressured by members of the ANC who don't want to be infiltrated, and other members of the ANC who are coming back and saying you've given up on the struggle and you're sipping fine brandy, and he gets all of these criticisms. And that is what leads a group of 7, which is led by Chris Hani, to draft a memorandum which basically says that the MK command is no longer interested in fighting at home, but they're not alone. There's another group which had but they'd been part of this infiltration in Mozambique. They draft a document which is titled What the Group Feels, and they basically raise the same criticism, that the armed struggle has reached an impasse and there has to be a conference to organize the way forward. And that is what leads to the famous Morogoro conference, where the ANC comes together, one of 2 consultative conferences that they will hold during the years of external mission leadership, where they recalibrate the struggle.
Maybe it's a good place to take a break, but 2 quick strategic questions. I do think you must say more about these memoranda. What was the code? Because Chris was met with severe consequences, such that he was not even in the conference in Morogoro. Maybe you could conclude by what did the memorandum really mean in terms of ANC discipline?
Well, fortunately, we've managed to, researchers, and I'm speaking about Janet Smith and Beauregard Tromp and Hugh Macmillan, they've managed to source the original document in its entirety, which includes the criticisms of having been distracted from the struggle at home. They speak about mysterious business enterprises, so they're really going in for the MK High Command, basically accusing them of having betrayed the struggle at home, and they want to have the ANC military refocused at home. One perennial issue which has come up in the sources, and the historians who have worked on it in depth are not able to fully confirm whether Chris Hani was ever condemned to death or whether he was merely disciplined by the organization for having having spoken out of turn. But certainly there were severe consequences for him, which led at the very least for him not being a participant at the Morogoro conference. So those are all sorts of measures. But the ANC did decide to accede to the demand for a conference which was held in Morogoro.
Maybe the original, there's a resurfacing, obviously, from time to time of what Chris and the chaps actually said in the memoranda. I don't know if maybe that's the place we can start at, because from time to time when there are disagreements, the memoranda is provoked or it's evoked to say this and that about this one and that one. We'll come back to it. Please keep that in mind. At this stage in 1969, or at the end of the Sipolilo campaign, how many ANC military recruits are in the camps?
If there are precise numbers, I've not been able to access them. My best estimates about the total number which managed to leave South Africa and become
militarily
trained is based on Ronnie Castrol's estimates that were speaking about no more than 1,000, but it's certainly in the upper hundreds.
Mm-hmm. Do we know, like, in light of these ambitious campaigns, I mean, the reason I wanted you to draw that distance, that what they had to do is that this was almost already an impossible mission. I'm thinking about the Rhodesians. I mean, the Rhodesian is a heavily experienced military. It's an international military. These are Brits. They've just defeated Hitler maybe a decade ago, 2 decades ago. Very experienced generals and whatever. So are the South Africans, but in no way comparable across the continent. But I mean, the white settler, there's no such a phenomena. The next best thing to it was Algeria in terms of white settler community. And as all white settler communities go, they are militarized communities. This is a very ambitious project. As far as equipment and is concerned, when you look at that distance and the many problems you're going to meet, you need reinforcement, as you said. Firstly, of ammunition. You may have the guns, but you need reinforcement of, we need more bullets. Because we just had at some point, they had a 6-hour confrontation with the Rhodesians. A 6-hour standoff of open fire. Yeah. 6 hours is a very long time. And they would have more of those confrontations as Wanki. And when they did Sipolilo, you say, they managed to do this capacity for reinforcement. But the distance is, and they've got less than 1,000 people at that stage. Less than 1,000 people at that stage, militarily trained to carry on this objective. I pose again the question of Kotane. Was this premature?
Yes, in the following sense that if we take the ANC's own critique of its practice in 67 and 68, it's manifested in a document called the Strategy and Tactics Paper, which Joe Slovo, principal author, Joe Matthews, secondary author, and it's adopted by the Morogoro Conference. And their response is, in future, greater attention needs to be paid to what they call all-round political mobilization. There's a central dilemma which they're facing, which is, they face it themselves. There's no way of defeating the government according to the Strategy and Tactics Paper except through violence, because the government has shut itself off to all other methods. At the same time, how do you start violence? That's the fundamental problem. How do you get armed struggle going in South Africa? And they pose the problem as follows. If ANC is not able to show its military capacity, people will not flock to the military structures, so they need to form their military credibility. On the other hand, without political support, how are you going to be able to launch armed operations? Because fighters can't just be free floating. They need to have logistical support. They need to have food. They need to have people who will provide them cover. You need that support from the local population. So they're not able to fully work it out. It's not really thrashed out in the Strategy and Tactics Paper in any definite way.
But before that, you've already engaged in Wangi and Sipolilo.
So what their recommendation is that we need more attention to all-round political mobilization. Whatever the correct mix of military and political action is, there needs to be greater attention paid in the future to making sure local communities are mobilized to be able to
house us.
Welcome and
But we got to get them first.
Yeah.
The path to get to them.
It's a chicken and egg situation, as the saying goes, and that is something which is going to keep recurring during the armed struggle.
Okay. Shall we take a break and say this is the first part?
Cool.
Excellent.